we have three European countries, Ireland, Norway, and Spain, recognizing Palestine as a state. How do you see the current situation of Palestine and the conflict in Gaza? We've seen that ICC had a warrant on Netanyahu. Later on, we had ICJ putting just asking the Netanyahu administration not to attack Rafah, but we are seeing that they're attacking Rafah.
Well, they certainly don't. Netanyahu, Smotrich, Penigavir, the whole crew, they don't seem to care. They're continuing pretty much what they did before, including, apparently, even making grievous errors and killing lots of civilians in one fell swoop. And this is because they're careless. They're just careless. I listened to Hugo Chavez, who actually said the IDF was a bunch of cowards. I do think that he was probably something Venezuela needed, a people person, if you will, for a while. He like so many people, became corrupt. But the IDF is not the force it's been touted to be. That's one of the proof positives that's been put out across the Levant and across the world by this conflict. They are not as good as anybody thought they were, including themselves and including Netanyahu and the defense ministers and others. The second thing I would say is that I listened to some lawyers this morning for whom I have a great deal of respect, because I dealt with some of them when we were dealing with the International Criminal Court and with the International Court of Justice. And they were giving the argument, the legal argument, which is a very powerful argument for why Netanyahu's wrong about the court having no standing, because Palestine is not a state. And they went back and they went through the record and recognized how international institutions had posited upon Palestine at various times, some quite recently, because of the occupation, the official legal status of an entity under the UN, and therefore they do have standing. So that's a bull crap argument. They do have standing. And so this decision by the court to go after Netanyahu and after Yoav Gallant and after the three leaders of Hamas was a very balanced and smart decision. And if we're going to have anything even resembling a rules-based order in this world and have some international law that goes along with it, especially international criminal law and international humanitarian law, then we're going to have to start listening to these things, or we're going to revert back to pre-World War II. Or I could say all the way back to pre-US Civil War, because that's when the Geneva Conventions, and particularly the convention, the third one on prisoners of war, began to take shape. And after 1945, 46, 47, 48, the Nuremberg trials and so forth, they took very positive shape. And that's what we've been building on. And guess who's been the biggest builder? The United States of America. And now we're taking that entire edifice as it has blossomed in the ICJ and the ICC and elsewhere, and we're just tearing it apart. And we're doing it in such a hypocritical manner, because these lawyers were quoting Joe Biden about how Russia was subject to the ICC because of its criminal activities, war criminal activities in Ukraine, and then not doing a thing except complaining about and even threatening. And this is something else I heard this morning. There were real threats delivered to the International Criminal Court leadership, the prosecutors, by Mossad. Real hard threats. Families, members of their families, their futures. All of this was done, and this is just making it look all the worse for Israel, of course, making it the pariah state in the world right now, but also beginning to undo all the precious work that America and others have done since 1945 in order to protect people during wartime. And there's more to it than that, but these are rules to keep war from getting out of hand, or any more out of hand than it usually does, and to punish those who let it get out of hand afterwards or in situ during the actual conflict. And we're giving that a real blow, and I think it could be a deadly blow if we don't wake up and count our chickens. This is not what we should be doing.
We know that Netanyahu and his people are not going to participate in any sessions on the part of the ICJ. But do you think they would let Hamas leaders to participate? Because if they go there, they may reveal some truth about October 7 or something like that. That's why I do think that they're not going to let even them participate in these sessions.
Well, you're never going to get people who are under indictment. I shouldn't say never, but very rarely are you going to get people who have been summoned by the court or under indictment or whatever the legal terminology is to appear. Look back at Milosevic. Look at back Karadzic, Charles Taylor, the whole retinue of war criminals in the world. And this was another thing that we discussed this morning too, is look at what happened with the court in the beginning. What happened was the United States was able to use its power. And I know this. I was there when Powell was talking about this, when he was Secretary of State. We used our power to direct the court at Africa, at black people like Charles Taylor. We didn't want the court coming after white people. We wanted it going after black people. Well, the court finally awakened to that. I'm sure they were cognizant of it all along, but they awakened to it in a way that said, we need to be more balanced as jurists. If we're going to have any credibility in the world at all, we need to be more balanced. And that's how they ducked into the Balkans, because what happened there was white people. Now, they were Slavic white people. There were these horrible Serbs, and they were really horrible people like Radovan Karadzic and Milovan Slobodan, I can't even say the names anymore, Milosevic. And that sort of broadened the court a bit. They got some white people in there. And then the court, and I was in Paris in January 2019 when the Germans had come over to Paris and the Parisians and others were there. I think the Spanish were there too. And we were talking with, guess who? Former Guantanamo inmates. And these are people who'd been captured, put in Guantanamo, kept there for some time, brutally treated, and they were guilty of nothing than being there when they were captured. And so we had a real insight into what was happening in the European channels in terms of trying to go after a better court. We even had the prosecutor, actually it was a junior prosecutor who was involved in the first stage of investigating Afghanistan, come to Paris and sit down and talk to us. And she said, this is very informal because we don't have the rules of evidence and so forth that pertain in a formal investigation. But I can tell you, we probably are going to get together and recommend a formal investigation into the United States and into the Taliban and maybe the government of Afghanistan. And that's subsequently what happened. So they were expanding their writ slowly but surely to become a more balanced and a more fair process of jurisprudence with regard to war crimes. And I think they've done a marvelous job. And I find it a sort of delicious irony that South Africa, the former pariah state of the world, is a leading state in all of this, starting with their application to the court in the first place for genocide. So I don't find this to be a negative development, as President Biden seems to. I mean, his protestations are just horrible. I find it a very positive development. And I wish others, like these lawyers this morning, who also felt that way, would believe that this is a positive development. You know, we're not going to rid the world of war anytime soon, but we can rid the world of war criminals or punish them in a way that makes them regret and even, sends a signal to others that they shouldn't do it. That's what the court's purpose is. And to stand in its way because it steps on our toes just shows what small people we are.
Larry, when it comes to what's going on in Gaza, in Rafah right now, there are some ideas that they're talking about. The Israelis, initially, they start forcing these people from the northern part to the southern part of Gaza. Right now, they're pushing them to the central part near the Gaza pier. It seems there are some rumors that the U.S. Navy gonna take these people and just move them to the United States or European countries. How do you see, do you find any basis for this idea? Do you see any connection to what the Netanyahu administration right now is doing in Rafah and this idea?
All I see, Nima, is that he's doing the same thing he's been doing all along, and his henchmen are doing it with him. He's moving the population around in such a way that they're easier to kill. He's putting them in compact positions in very bad places where either they contract some sort of disease, or they can't be reached by food trucks, or they can be bombed more efficiently, or they die from some other reason, like wounds suffered in some previous bombing. So it looks to me like tactically they are moving the population around so that they can kill more of them. And I don't think there's any question of the United States evacuating people off of that pier. As I understand it, we've already badly injured one person and maybe injured 2 or 3 other soldiers on the pier. And as I said, I think, I don't remember if it was your show, but I essentially said, wait and see. Lots of food can pour down that pier, but once it hits the ground, the World Food Program and others are responsible for it, and it's not going to get distributed very well because they just don't have a plan and they don't have security. And if the IDF has agreed to provide security, they'll just use that provision to kill more Palestinians. And I believe that sincerely. That's their purpose now, is to, before this ends by force or his removal from office or whatever, Netanyahu, they're going to kill as many Palestinians as they possibly can. And they're going to put the fear of God, you know, who's ever God, into all the rest of them, so they'll leave. They don't want anybody left. They don't want any plan for Gaza that includes anything but Israelis.
Did you see the latest interview of Netanyahu on CNN? He was talking with Jake Tapper, in which in this interview he said that no, we are not blocking everything. We are just letting the food and everything go to Gaza, and we are not. He was denying everything, and the problem is that Jake Tapper is not pushing the idea that you're not doing this. You're just blocking everything.
First, Netanyahu he lies almost routinely. Second, we act as if we believe his lies so that those lies, we hope, will prevail. And thirdly, we ask our allies to believe those lies, therefore reinforcing the validity of them. That's the way they've been operating since this started. I should say that's the way Netanyahu has been operating since 15, 16 years ago. Lies are part of it. It's not just Mossad that lies all the time, like our CIA lies for a profession, as John McLaughlin used to say. It's the leadership. The leadership lies too. And after all, let's check Joe Biden out. Joe Biden lies too. Blatant lies about Ukraine, about Gaza. This is a way of life with these people, and nothing stands in their way. And Netanyahu is the master of that particular characteristic. Nothing stands in his way. If he's standing in front of a billboard that is scarlet, he will tell you it is black as the ace of spades and walk off the stage. And you are to believe it is black as the ace of spades, because 4 billionaires are going to descend on your head the next morning and dump all the money necessary to eliminate you from existence if you don't. That's the way they operate. And it's falling apart right now. It's all falling apart. The propaganda campaigns, the Mossad campaigns, the Netanyahu lies, the Smotrich lies, the Yoav Gallant lies, everything is falling apart right now. Even the whole idea of the IDF's impregnability, of its invincibility, it's cast to the winds now, because Hamas is taking them on in the north and throughout Gaza with alacrity now. And they are losing people left and right. If there's anything that's going to stop this, it'll be the hostages and the number of IDF soldiers that are getting killed. Netanyahu is not going to be able to survive that once the word gets back into his population that these numbers are going down under Hamas's guns. But that's going to take a while. That's going to take a while because they have this very tight procedure on reporting these sorts of things, and the information doesn't get back. Just as Ukraine has these kind of procedures so that the real reporting on the casualties doesn't get back, or when it does get back, it's way after time. Most militaries do that. We did that. We lied about Tet, for example, in '68 in Vietnam. We've lied about casualties ever since we started going to war, wherever it was. I'm sure George Washington even had a time or two that he didn't quite tell the Continental Congress how many people he lost. So it's a nature of war, but when it becomes a daily practice, the way Netanyahu and his boys do it, or the way, for example, we were doing it in Afghanistan and in Iraq with civilian casualties, not necessarily our own, it becomes an art form, lying.
Yeah. But in your opinion, as you said, everything is falling apart. And we've seen that these 3 European countries are recognizing the state of Palestine. How do you see the policy in Europe? Do you see some sort of changes in Europe, or they're still totally in line with Netanyahu?
The changes are coming. The changes are coming because the leaders are losing their electorates. I was looking at Germany again today. I don't know how he's holding on. The only reason he is because the opposition is just clueless as to what to do in his stead, were they to have elections and win. But Europe is conflicted right now, very conflicted, over Ukraine and over Gaza. And these two things together, I recommend this to you if you have time. It's a long disquisition. It's a peroration almost. It's a German general, Luftwaffe general, of all things, a Luftwaffe general quoting Clausewitz and Alexander the Great. He gave about a 30-minute talk. His name is Harold Kujat. And he is as erudite a German as I've listened to. And German military professionals who are erudite usually are erudite. He talked about everything from the very beginning, when Putin told everyone in Europe, all the NATO leaders, that he didn't want to do anything in Ukraine, that all he wanted was space between the potential for an attack on Russia and Russia. That's all he wanted. He went through that. Then he went through the Minsk agreement. He went through the coup. He went through the Minsk agreement. He went through the signing of the document, or the initialing of the document, and Zelensky's total favor of that document. It could have stopped the war right there, and Ukraine would have lost very little, and Putin would have stopped and gotten what he wanted. And no, so here we are today. And then he goes into his Clausewitz and he says, yeah, okay, Odessa's going to go, and Kharkiv is going to go, and they're going to push inexorably, and they're going to do nothing but defend and kill Ukrainians and kill Ukrainians, and then hop a little further, kill some more Ukrainians, and then defend and defend. And then he's got it down pat. And he knows, and I know, Putin does not want Ukraine. He never wanted Ukraine. He wanted space. He wanted space so people couldn't do, for example, what Ukraine did, shoot his radars that protect him against U.S. ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads on them. And whoever authorized that strike was an absolute moron. That's the way you threaten Russia to the point where it does become okay for them to come back with a nuclear weapon, because you're taking down their safeguards against an attack from the United States. We don't have any empathy in Washington. We are incapable of thinking about what Russia, already so big it can't run itself, literally all the way out to Vladivostok, thinks when it considers the nuclear stockpile that we have, and how many seconds are between the unleashing of that stockpile and complete destruction for Russia. And so we go after some of the things they have put in place to give them 19 to 20 seconds or 19 to 20 minutes of warning time so they can do something. This is absurd. We're acting as if there is nothing on the other side worthy of note. And so this war is just going again and again and again with a good old boy in Ukraine against this something that's not worthy of note. Call it Russia. That's preposterous. And this German general just blasts this whole theory that we have about bleeding Russia. And he gets the strategy right, too. We're doing this not to save Ukraine. We don't give a hang about Ukraine. We're doing it to bleed Russia and to try and fuse Europe together so that with a very bloody Russia and a fused Europe with Japan and South Korea, we can go after China. That's the whole reason for doing this. And it's a preposterous strategy because we're going to bleed ourselves, not physically, but financially, economically, and ultimately we're going to strip our NATO allies away from us before we take on China. And we're going to be standing there without the resources or the wherewithal to take on China. So this strategy makes no sense, but I think he's got it pegged as to what the real purpose for all this is and why we're doing what we're doing in the face of the senselessness that seems to pervade it, because we think it's going to help us get to China ultimately. Well, how you can continue to think that if you're Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and Joe Biden watching the BRICS get more powerful every day, watching Russia and China fuse them, watching them dealing not only with a new currency and a new medium of exchange, but also a system within which that medium of exchange can work, whether it's gold-based or commodity-based or whatever, how you can watch all that happening and not understand that you're wrong and you better change really rapidly is beyond me. I can only consign it to the idiocy in the White House. We have no leadership.
Larry, we in Ukraine right now, we've seen that Russians are moving a lot of weapons to the northern part of Ukraine. And how do you see the situation there? Are they trying to capture Kharkov, or they're in the business of making a buffer zone?
I think there are three things going on, Nima. One, they are adjusting their process in Ukraine to be mostly defensive to cut down on casualties and to maximize Ukrainian casualties. And they're doing it in strategic points. They're not going to surrender anything, and they may take a little more. And this German general said, nah, I'd take Odessa. Yeah, I would too. I've been saying that all along. Cut Ukraine off from the entire Black Sea and improve your strategic position considerably. And that leads to the second thing they're doing. They're repositioning forces and repositioning, and this is very important, their economy so that it can absorb not the 6 to 6.5% of GDP it was absorbing for the war, but up to 8 and maybe 8.5% of that GDP to build the forces for the war with NATO, if it comes. And then the third thing they're doing, I think, is presenting the alliance that's forming out there, some of it inchoate on the fringes right now, but in the center, it's pretty solid, Moscow and Beijing, and perhaps Pyongyang and Tehran. And I'm hearing more and more, and this truly worries me, really worries me, because I think India is the coming country, even more so than China in 25 years, I think. But India is figuring out where it wants to go. And I'm seeing more and more signs that India is sniffing the winds. It's already a BRIC member. It's sniffing the winds as to be, consolidated within that configuration, particularly for economic reasons. And so if this develops, Putin's got everything he wants. And all he's got to do is he could hold on in Ukraine and keep a what I would call a stabilizing force there, a defensive force, and say to Kyiv, do what you need to do. I'm out of here, but you're not coming an inch further to the east. Oh, and by the way, I've got all your ports.
Larry, do we know right now what is the official strategy of NATO in Ukraine? Are they seeking some sort of escalations, in your opinion? Are they?
Desperation. Yes, desperation. I think you've got people like Stoltenberg, and I understand he was chastised majorly by 2 NATO members today. What the hell are you saying? I wouldn't be surprised to see him removed. You can't be doing this sort of stuff. I think he thinks he's a general. You know, he's Secretary General. I think he thinks he's a general. I think he wants to wear some stars, and he wants to go out with some rockets. We don't need that. We don't need that at all. What we need, and here I go back to the Luftwaffe general again, we need a peace agreement. We need a ceasefire. We need a peace agreement. And we need to start refurbishing Ukraine and neutrality to be the future. And if you are interested, Europe, in your own security identity, which you should be, I was so pleased to hear him say that. You should be interested in breaking away from Washington to the extent that they do not exercise hegemony over you. You know, you can be friends, you can trade, you can have financial relations, you can have economic relations, but you do not need America to continue to drive you into hell. You know, there are other people in the world, and the other people in the world are now, he's been doing his work too. 3.6 billion people are lining up against you. That's not good. So you need to start acting a little more independently, and you need to start acting a little more rationally and in your own self-interest. Good words, powerful words. And of course, he talked about the phenomenon of Trump, and he said, essentially, if he comes in, and it's looking more and more like he might have the potential to come in, we might have to do it overnight. And he's right.
How do you see French training Ukrainians? What do they have to offer for the Ukrainians? Ukrainians were in this conflict, have been in this conflict for more than 2 years. They have much more experience than French. But when it comes to the contribution on the part of the French to Ukrainians, what they're doing, in your opinion, to help Ukrainians?
They're trying to build up Macron's bona fides for war. I mean, so much is going on now, Nima, in individual countries and certainly in Washington because of domestic political circumstances. We have, I think I mentioned this the other day, I think it's all of them now. Of all the OECD countries, or let's call them the Western liberal democracies, though I sometimes hesitate to use the word liberal for some of them, they have the lowest poll ratings in years for their political leaders right now. That's a recipe for bad decision making because they're making their decisions on a daily basis based on domestic politics, not based on their borders and external security and foreign relations, but on domestic politics. No one is more indicative of that than Germany and France. And they're the linchpins outside Turkey of Europe. So that's bad. That's bad for them to be doing this. And now that I mentioned Erdogan and Turkey, it's bad there too. And I've noted, you know, he keeps on with his remarks. He keeps on saying he's going to do this, he's going to do that, he's going to do this with regard to Netanyahu and calling him all sorts of names, but he's really not doing anything. And I mentioned this to a former member of NATO, a general officer from Brussels, still lives in Brussels, the other day, and he said to me, you know, Erdogan really is not counted on anymore in NATO, not really. And I said, yeah, I could figure that. I mean, I saw that even as early as 2000 and 2001. Yeah, but you don't understand, it's the largest land army in NATO, and it's probably the most powerful army in NATO, and that includes the US. And he's right about that because we are really a paper tiger right now. And they don't count on them anymore. So I'm just kind of doing my military math. Okay, who do you count on? And that's a problem too.
Yeah. Biden was talking on the Memorial Day. He said that the US Army saved the world from fascism in the war in World War II. And Russian ambassador to the United States said this comment is outrageous because he's not telling the reality.
It
And
is outrageous. I will give Biden this, but I will almost guarantee you that Joe Biden, the Joe Biden I knew for many years, doesn't know this. Yes, the United States, with its Lend-Lease program and its arsenal of democracy strategy, supplied the Free French, the Polish, the Soviets, the Brits, and anybody else contesting under the sobriquet we called ourselves then, people have forgotten it, the United Nations. Only occasionally did we call ourselves the Allies. Eisenhower, whenever he would give a talk to the troops or anything, he would say, the United Nations, because that's what we called ourselves. That's where the title came from for the organization in New York. That was our contribution, and it was a significant contribution. We pumped so many trucks, so many tanks, so many airplanes, so much food, so much ammunition, artillery and otherwise, into the Soviet Union that you could say we had a hand in their defeat of the Wehrmacht. But they defeated the Wehrmacht. From Stalingrad to Berlin, they fought more Germans than anybody else on the continent. So to say that the Great War, the Great Patriotic War for the Soviet Union, or to leave it out, say it was nothing, or to leave it out, which is hinting that it was nothing, is just preposterous, and it shows the ignorance of Joe Biden.
but in your opinion, when he talks this way, does he really believe that? Is there anybody out there buying these type of arguments?
Oh, Americans buy them. Americans buy them. We're the stupidest people on the face of God's green earth. We buy those arguments. Not all of us, but a great many Americans buy those arguments. Now, I'm happy to say, I'm elated to say, after watching these young people on these campuses all across America, that is changing. But it's changing because these kids don't like war. And that's good. That's very good. And I pray that no one teaches them to like war. But that's not really a comment on their knowledge of past wars. Our knowledge in America of wars and wars we've engaged in is abysmal.
Putin, in his recent contact with the press, he said that it's true that the presidential elections are not held while the martial law is in place in Ukraine. But it doesn't mean that Zelensky's presidency can be prolonged and can be extended. And it seems that the Russians are already talking about the former president of Ukraine. They don't recognize Zelensky as the president of Ukraine. In your opinion, the continuation of Zelensky in this position, as he has led Ukraine to this disaster that we're witnessing right now, would help Ukraine?
That's a good question. Without going into the legal aspects of it, which I am not expert in anyway, I think it's a ploy by Putin to leverage his negotiating stance a little bit. I think if it were down to it and Zelensky were on the other side of the table as one of the negotiators for the other side, as it were, Putin would accept it ultimately if the parameters for the negotiations were satisfactory for him. And he's laid those out in press conferences and other places. He's laid those out. He's got what he wants. Let's talk. I mean, that's essentially what Lavrov and he are saying. But Lavrov comes across with a bitterness to his that tells me that Sergei knows that we are dishonest, dissembling, and we'll do anything we possibly can to make them look like fools. And that doesn't make Sergei very happy. And I don't blame him. Colin Powell was the last. Call up Sergei Lavrov and ask him who the last American Secretary of State he gave a shit for was. He will say Colin Powell. That's the last Secretary of State who knew what he was doing in the job. And he was hampered by the president and vice president he had. And General Harold Kupcha, the one I was telling Kuchat that I was telling you about before, he went through the various treaties. George Bush eliminating the ballistic missile treaty, terrible mistake. I agree with the general on that wholeheartedly. Terrible mistake. It opened Putin up for doubt about our sincerity with regard to the most important weaponry on earth, nuclear weapons. That treaty being abrogated so single-handedly, so abruptly, and Powell realized this. He realized this. That's the reason he dispatched people to Moscow right away to talk to the leadership. And then to do away with the treaties that we did away with in the subsequent years and come up to start and make it, by our posture in Ukraine, untenable, New START. We destroyed everything. So why wouldn't Putin think we were fabricators, liars, cheaters, bums? You think up your epithet. He would be within his perfect right to think all those things about us, because we have violated everything that we promised to keep intact for the world's safety for the past 25 years. I wouldn't trust us any further than I could spit.
This summit in June in Switzerland, they were talking about that they invited Brazil, South Africa. The Brazil, Lula said that he's not going to be there because it doesn't matter, because Russia is not there. The head of South Africa said the same thing. It seems that Chinese, she is not going to send anybody there. Biden, even Bloomberg reported Biden is not going to be there. And Zelensky is not happy that Biden is not going to be there. And how do you see this summit in Switzerland? Why they're doing this? I think it would be better to cancel this summit. Nobody seems to care about this summit.
Send Jens Stoltenberg. He can represent everyone. He seems to be capable of it. I don't know, but this isn't the beginning of what was it Churchill said? This is the end of the beginning. And we may be looking at how do we withdraw ourselves from supporting Ukraine and Zelensky in particular. And we'll be just as bad at that as we were exiting Afghanistan. I guarantee you we will make as many mistakes in backing off from Ukraine as we did in backing off from Afghanistan. And we may get a lot of people killed, including Ukrainians.
Larry, we know that you talk about George W. Bush. He was, when he was in power, he was in office, he was pushing this idea of NATO expansion. In your opinion, it was his decision to do that, or there were people in his government that was there, that those people were forcing him to do that?
The neoconservatives were all over him to do that. But he saw, as he did with, let me back up for a minute, he turned China, thank God, he turned China over to Colin Powell. It was the one major portfolio that Powell had no contest over. Cheney tried to take it away from him. Rumsfeld tried to take it away from him. They tried to send people that were above the agreed level of dignitary to Taipei every week to get Chen Shui-bian, then the president of Taiwan, to vote for independence, a red line with Beijing. And we sent someone right behind them to disabuse CSB of that feeling. It was weekly almost. We had to do that. But Bush understood the importance of China to the U.S. economy, and he understood the importance of the U.S. economy to his re-election. And so, again, domestic politics, but it worked, and we kept the relationship with China on an even keel. Didn't work in the other areas because there wasn't so much an economic dimension to it, and so Cheney could push Bush and push him, and NATO was one of the things he pushed him on. Why did the former CEO of Halliburton want to have Poland buying defense items from the United States of America? I think Cheney had a portfolio of about $71 billion at that time from his CEO-ship. I'll tell you why he wanted more nations in NATO, so you could sell more weapons to them, and so he could make more money. And that was the reason for Rumsfeld, too. That was the reason for all these big oligarchs who were heavily invested in the defense industries. More war, more countries to participate in those wars, more countries on our side in those wars, more weapons sales. Think Ukraine today.
And Larry, when you talk about neocons, in these people were in power since the aftermath of the World War II. Who are these people? Because when we talk about Republican, Democrats, they were always in power in the United States. Are they really Republicans or Democrats? And they don't care about Democrats and Republicans. They're just in the center and taking and ruling the government.
It would take me 2 hours to give you a disquisition on the neoconservatives, but let me just say that they're both, and they're not. They don't really have party affiliations, especially now with Trump sort of having cultified the GOP. A lot of neoconservatives are sort of, moving over, checking their six because they don't care for Trump that much. Now, some of them do. Some of them see him as an avenue into what they want, but most of them don't. They've always been with us. They were there. Paul Nitze was there writing the document that became the Bible for the Cold War. Harry Truman, when he first saw that document, ooh, take this away. I think Harry didn't want to look at it because he had about a $11-12 billion budget at that time. Think of that. $11 or $12 billion budget. And he wanted to keep it that way. And he saw that if he did that to take on the Soviet Union, he saw that budget going to 50, 60 billion. Korea comes along, budget goes to $54 billion overnight. And Harry had to change his mind a little bit. But they were there. Paul Nitze was a neoconservative par excellence. Eisenhower wouldn't even let him come to the solarium exercise. Eisenhower's henchman said, no, you got to have Nitze. He's the guy who wrote you got to have him, and he's got to be one of the team leaders. No, Eisenhower didn't even want him in the room. And Kennan didn't want him in the room either, George Kennan. So they've been with us all along, and they've been of various party affiliations. But they never really counted on political parties to be their avenues for security influence. They counted on their intelligence, their expertise, their think tankness, their collegiate professorial expertise and so forth to infiltrate the government and advise. They didn't necessarily want to be the key figures, the principals. They wanted to advise them. And they built up this intellectual entourage that began to influence, particularly after 9/11. 9/11 was a gift for them. It was a gift out of heaven. That they said things like, how can we do what we want to do now if we don't have a Pearl Harbor? If we don't have something like Pearl Harbor to give us the impetus, to give us the American people on a platter, we can't do it. Ooh, along came 9/11. Some have even insinuated, conspiracy theorists that maybe some of them had something to do with 9/11. I don't believe that, but it was fortuitous for them. And ever since then, they have infiltrated government to a degree where you sometimes can't find them, but you know them. By the way they speak, talk, and the influence that they bear. Victoria Nuland surfaces, or someone like Scooter Libby surfaces, or someone like John Hanna surfaces, and they're at the top of the influence chain now. And so they began to speak and they began to influence, and you see them and they're there. Very insidious, but they're very smart people. They know their brief. They're sort of like Mossad. They're sort of like that group. They know how to lie. They know how to cheat. They know how to steal. They know how to. Richard Haass called them extraordinary bureaucratic entrepreneurs, which is a good term, a felicitous term. That's what they are. They know how to make other people do the damage for them.
Because, Larry, when it comes to Russia and China and their understanding of the United States, it's so confusing for them. Even Putin in his interview says, I don't understand the rationale behind the behavior of the United States. And it's so confusing. And every time they're failing in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're just doubling down instead of going after some sort of solution for what they've been doing for a long time.
Empires at the end of their chain, if you will, usually have the tendency to double down on strategic defeat and deepen the defeat. And that leads to their ultimate demise. Whether it's the Romans at Cannae, losing 70,000 in 24 hours of battle, and we say 75 years later, they came back and went to Africa and beat the hell out of the Carthaginians. Yeah, well, time is compressed today. You don't have 75 years between your major battles, and you don't have that time to recover, and you don't have time to let Hannibal die. It's a different world today in terms of how empires get built and grow and expire. And I think the signs are very, very vivid right now that there's two things happening in this country, the United States of America, that are indicative that we're at the end of our tether. One is the potential for dismemberment internally, and Donald Trump personifies that. The other is the potential for major defeat on the battlefield, or defeats on the battlefield that so sour the nation that we come home and go into another phase of real isolationism, not like the interwar years. That wasn't isolationism. That was a retrenchment from World War I, the bloodiest war to that point in human history, and a kind of licking of wounds, counting of money. We made so much money off reparations and everything. It wasn't really isolationism. And then along came World War II and put us, in the pinnacle. And we have not adjusted very well to that pinnacle post Eisenhower, the first 8 years of that situation, if you will. 50% of the world's GDP, the enemies that we had defeated prostrate at our feet. The allies that we had helped prostrate at our feet. Russia was just torn to pieces. France was torn to pieces. Britain was torn to pieces. We had 8 to 12 years there of just honeymoon. Everything was perfect, except we had bad race relations and other things like that. But that's gone. That's gone. We're fighting each other internally now in ways I have not seen. I lived through the protests against the Vietnam War. I'm waiting to see what the '68 Democratic Convention is going to repeat in Chicago this year. I'm waiting to see what happens. If these kids keep doing what they're doing, these young men and women keep doing what they're doing on these college campuses, and it grows and fuses, then the Democrats are going to have the bloody-mindedest convention they could ever. Joe Biden won't even be able to get through the door. So we have real problems internally right now. And we're making all these mistakes that you and I have elucidated in interview after interview on the international scene. I don't know how we're going to make it. I really don't. And on top of all of that, we have nuclear weapons with no treaties. Even Putin has said that. Putin has said the other day, he said, we have no treaties left. We have no treaties left. One of the first things I bet you'll see him and China and others doing is trying to fuse a treaty relationship, maybe even minus us. I wouldn't blame him a bit, and I would applaud it if they did that.
The United States' attitude toward Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had Gorbachev, and after that Yeltsin. When Putin came to power, and he was totally pro-Europeans, pro even the United States. He was so much in favor of the policy and joining the United States and Europeans.
My Luftwaffe general made a point about that, and particularly in '97, when they got together and they were going to fight the world if the world wanted to contest them, Europe and Russia together.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you see the United States' attitude toward Russia makes Putin even, I don't know, if going to be the worst enemy of the United States. Why they're doing this? They're in the process of making Xi as well, just turning everybody into an enemy for the United States.
Going back to my Luftwaffe general again, this was the greatest strategic mistake he's seen the United States make in his lifetime. I think he's right. I think he's right. And it had a lot to do, and I didn't expect him to talk about this because he's not an American, obviously. It had a lot to do with the influence of these people I've been talking about, the neoconservatives. Whether you call them Barry Goldwaters, or you call them Leon Trotskys, or you call them, who best personifies what, the Benedict Arnolds? They are poisonous people. And their whole philosophy is Netanyahu's philosophy. I'm right and you're wrong. My intellect exceeds yours by fathoms. I'm right and you're wrong. If you don't do what I tell you to do, I'll kill you. If you don't do what I tell you to do, and yet I can turn you into a manipulative slave to do what I want you to do, I'll keep you around. But I'm the genius in the room, and we're going to do what we think of. Victoria Nuland. Just think of those moments when she exposed her poison to the world. Just those few moments, and you've got these people. And I know people tell me, well, there aren't enough of them. No, you don't understand. There are lots of them. We have been turning them out. The think tanks have been churning them out for years and years, ever since Scoop Jackson sort of, I think it was Scoop that said something like, well, that guy was a conservative, but or that guy was a liberal, but he was mugged by reality. Liberal, okay, now I'm a conservative. It has something to do with the Trump phenomenon too. And you have people who aren't capable intellectually of expressing it the way the neoconservative would, because they haven't been to a doctoral program and written exhaustive papers on their theories of international relations. These people have. And when they adopted the attitude that Charles Koch adopted with regard to taking over the American government, and all these things kind of go hand in hand too. And when they adopted the attitude that Lewis Powell expressed in his memo that essentially led to Citizens United and the pollution of our political process with money. And just think about that for a moment. This is just a little sidestep from that. Think about the sheer post revelations of the Jewish American billionaires who are ruining our universities, polluting our universities with their money, and telling someone like the president of Harvard or the president of Columbia, I gave you $100 million. You will put those students in jail. You will shut down these protests. You will change Columbia's attitude about the war in Gaza, or I'll pull my $100 million out. All of this goes together. And it's very difficult to fight it if you're on the inside, you're a decent person, you're honest, and maybe you think halfway decent strategically. You get overwhelmed by these people. I thought Colin Powell could beat anyone. He couldn't. These people beat him.
Sometimes I think that these are the worst enemy of the United States because they're destroying the United States from within.
Yes. The way historically empires usually get destroyed. Think of the Romans at the end. One thing, when Powell hired me in January of 1989, I asked him a question as I was walking out of the door in the Pentagon. I said, I really don't want the job. I'd already told him that. But if you pick me, I guess I'll serve. Something to that effect. And he said, well, if I pick you, it'll probably be because you're not a lean and hungry Cassius. I said, no, I'm not. He said, that's good. I don't like ambitious men around me. Well, there's a lot of ambitious men and women in Washington, D.C. who are full of poison. And I put Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan at the top of that list. Not necessarily the most intelligent. No. But certainly equipped with a lot of venom.